Are you the one, struggling with negative thoughts in your head that wake you up at 3 a.m.? Are you the one, trying to shut up that voice with medications or drugs to no avail, maybe even having an addiction now? Are you the one, that is under the control of your fear alter ego? Well, if that's the case, then sit back, tune in, and listen up to Shut Up, Stop Talking to Me, a podcast by Dr. Chris Allen Shreve, PhD. This is an in-depth clinical expose into the mind of trauma and the negative voice. Stay tuned.
Good evening. I'm Renisha Mullen. I'm here with Dr. Chris Allen Shreve, and we've been discussing his new book, Shut Up, Stop Talking to Me. Dr. Shreve, tell me a little bit about that title. That's kind of interesting there.
Well, thank you, and thank you for hosting me today. Yes, this has been something that I've been working on for quite a while. And Shut Up, Stop Talking to Me, as comical as it sounds, I think it's something we can all relate to. That's referring to that negative voice in our head.
Okay, I was just about to ask, who are you talking to?
Well, sometimes people wonder, is there somebody else inside my head that is, rocking the bodysuit and competing with me like I'm competing with the, my authentic self. So this title came up from this idea that many people were coming into my office in fight or flight. And they would tell me things like, if I could just shut up this voice in my head, I would be fine. And so after a while, after about the 1,000th person said that to me, I'm like, well, what do you hear in your head? And so when I started asking people what they heard, it seemed to be everything was fear. And I said, well, how is that possible that everybody is hearing a message of fear with their own voice tone in their head? Mm-hmm. So then, I started to really try to understand, well, what is going on? Because everybody was walking in depression, anxiety, insomnia, and overthinking. And, as a clinician, we're kind of trained to follow that trail, to kind of figure out how bad the symptoms are and develop a treatment plan and so forth. And so, I've been in the field 31 years now. And so we would hear all these symptoms. And so you kind of try to, develop a plan to deal with the symptoms. Mm-hmm. But then I went to a training. I was in my doctorate program, and I went to a conference in California, and it was about trauma and PTSD, and it was the practitioner who was doing the round robin. He said, most patients that walk in our office are in a state of trauma. Now, he works with veterans at the VA in California, but he said, I'm not referring to veterans. I'm not referring to soldiers. I'm referring to the majority of the population. Now, I'm sitting at my table, and I'm, shaking my head and disagreeing with him under my breath. And I'm like, I don't agree with that. Because, I'm trained clinically. No, they have depression, they have anxiety, they have this, that, and the other thing. But then as he kept talking, he said, well, he kept explaining his argument. And so I was listening. I said, well, a lot of patients I've had, which at that point, majority of them were substance abuse patients. I said, well, a lot of them did have a trauma story, or they had been overexposed to fear, and living a life of an addict can be a lot of attacks and a lot of turmoil and a lot of trauma. So I said, well, okay, well, maybe he has something with this. Mm-hmm. So I came home, and I was thinking on the flight, maybe he has something with this. And so I decided to agree with him.
Okay.
And I came back that Monday to my office, and I was doing a lot of evaluations of first patients, new patients. And so I took a very radical approach, and that's kind of what I write in the book. And so I said to a new patient, didn't matter who you were, didn't matter what you came in with, I just took a chance. And so I started to ask people, what's your first fear?
Now, are we talking about the first thing that comes to mind, or the first fearful experience in life that we can remember?
Good question. Well, I try to get to the very first fear that a person can remember.
Okay.
Because a lot of times people's memories, especially depending on how old they are, it can get a little sketchy. And some memories can be blocked out because of trauma. So, but I asked the first fear question because as Freud, I'm a Freudian basically, and Freud kind of really got into early childhood experiences, and I really find there's a lot of valid meat and a lot of good psychodynamic information that we as clinicians can use to figure out the story or the mystery sometimes. So the first fear question really takes a person back to when I think begins the activation of these trauma fight or flight circuits. Because the amygdala, which is the brain organ that is responsible for that fight or flight reaction, it's like a radar that turns on, like very much like a plane.
Mm-hmm.
And so, plane's radar, as soon as you start flying, the radar's on, and it makes you aware of anything that is in your field that could come into your flight path. And it's designed to alert you to disaster. Like it could be a mountain coming, it could be low altitude, it could be another plane coming, it could be a UFO coming. So the radar does its job. It beeps when there's things on that screen.
Yeah.
Now you as the pilot, you have to look at the screen and determine what the beep is. And so that amygdala is that sort of circuitry that turns on to alert us in our lives of anything that comes into our atmosphere or in our radar range, if you would. That could be a fear or an overexposure to fear or something that could attack us.
So this little voice in our head, I like that analogy that you use. We're the pilot, that's our radar. This little voice, we've convinced ourselves that it's there to alert us of danger, right?
Right.
So how can why shouldn't we trust it?
Well, I mean, it's a system that we should trust if it's activated in the right way. I mean, it's a natural system. Like if you're, walking down the street and it's dark and you're by yourself and you're female, your senses start to let you know it's dark, I'm by myself, and I should be maybe a little more alert of my surroundings. Mm-hmm. It's sort of like a natural occurrence that happens with most people. Now, you don't go into natural panic attack. Now, here's where you might. Let's say you had a past where you were attacked, right?
Okay.
And you survived, and you were better and all of that. But then here you're walking down a similar street that replicates that type of attack that happened 10, 15, 20, 50 years ago. Your amygdala or that radar circuit says, hey, this looks familiar to us. Mm-hmm. Something bad happened on a street like this years ago. So we're alerting you by having a little startle response, a little panic attack of sorts. You're going to start breathing a little bit, and we're going to maybe hyperventilate, and you're going to, start to look around and get a little paranoid. But we just want your eyes to open up a little bit so you can be aware of what's going on. We want to get more oxygen into your lungs in case you have to actually run or fight, and hopefully not freeze.
Yeah.
So that circuit begins to take over, and then we begin to go into this fight or flight reaction.
So it's that voice, that radar, coupled with traumatic experiences from our past that start to cause these problems, right? That alter ego to take over.
Well, I think the emergence of the alter ego, I don't think it emerges, immediately. Here's how I kind of conceptualize it.
Okay.
And this is more like getting into the theory of the book. So, as I said, when I went to that conference, I came back and I started asking questions, that first fear question. And so then what would pop out would be stories that would be very innocent sometimes. Now, these people could be 50, 60, 70 years old. It doesn't matter really the age. What I discovered is most people are coming in a state of fight or flight. Mm-hmm. And that could be, what I realized is that, we're trained to look at anxiety, depression, and overthinking, and insomnia. But what I now see is that, like for men, depression manifests sometimes in irritability and aggression. So to me, I kind of see depression as sort of fight sometimes with some people.
Okay.
Right? I can see when some people start to develop anxieties and fear, they begin to either avoid situations or they shut down and they freeze. And so I begin to start to see that there's maybe an overlap matrix of primary clinical symptoms that really might be more of the proof that a person's in fight or flight. So now, that's why I'm not that interested, respectfully, clinically respectful, that in their symptoms, because the symptoms now, to me, prove that they're in a state of fight or flight.
So what puts us in this state of fight, flight, or freeze?
Right. And there's a fourth one, and we'll talk about that one a little bit, and that's fornicate. Mm-hmm. So it's here's my new definition of trauma. Trauma throws people off. Many of us have not experienced a trauma, but many of us have experienced being overexposed to fear and or being under some type of attack or having been attacked of some type. Now, I draw that as a wider net. The reason why I purposefully define it that way, because when I say, well, have you had any trauma in your life? And you'll say, well, no, not really. I mean, I lost somebody. I had this, a dog died. But we don't really...
Because we're thinking the traditional sense
yes,
of the word. Okay.
Yeah, like a soldier story.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I wasn't in Vietnam. I didn't go to, Iraq or Kuwait. So a lot of people equate it like that. So when I would say trauma, that would not capture these stories. So then when I redefined it as saying overexposure to fear and or some type of attack, then people would say, oh yeah, well, I was bullied when I was a kid and my parents attacked me with their opinions about me, or, I was poor and I was living in poverty, and so I was always attacked by not having food in the fridge, and not always worried about when I went out the house would I be safe, going from my friend's house. Or so when I started to hear these stories, I realized they had the same ability to turn on the same fight or flight circuits that happen to people with more extreme trauma. And so when I define trauma is overexposure to fear and or being under attack, most people can connect with that definition. Mm-hmm. So then that's when the stories will pop out. And then that's when I start to see the trail emerge. Okay? And that's when many people begin to go into this fight or flight. I'll give you a good story. For example, I had a patient who was an IT master's in IT, and he was working for Blue Cross Blue Shield. And he was near retirement, but he wasn't ready to retire. He had just got his master's. He was excited. He was ready to kind of like knock it out and do some more stuff with his career. So long story short, there was some kind of investigation going on, and that he thought he might be a part of. Mm-hmm. And it sounded like what he thought could have been very serious. So he was a very happy-go-lucky guy, and all of a sudden he started going off on his coworkers, and he was very irritable coming to work and stuff like that. And so his boss, who was a good friend of his, she said, look, if you don't cool out, I'm going to have to fire you. So she said, well, why don't you think about early retirement or working from home? Mm-hmm. And this is before COVID. And so he's like, well, I don't want to retire, and, I don't like working from home. So I think he tried working home for a little bit. His kids are grown. His wife, she had her own little life and rhythm, so she wasn't home. And so he was sitting home, working from home, but it just didn't work for him. So he ended up going back to work. So it was still happening. So he came to see me, and so we started working on, coping skills and, meditation and, go for a walk on lunch break, little stuff like that. So then one day I was running my mouth and we were talking, just getting ready to start a session, and so I said, the top 3 things that most people come into therapy for are fear, shame, and trauma. And he said, really? He said, well, what's trauma? And I said, well, trauma, like what might be traumatizing to me might not be traumatizing to you. Mm-hmm. It can start to activate certain fight or flight reactions like fight, flight, freeze. You can have insomnia that can be triggered. A lot of different things happen when you're traumatized. It can trigger fear. People can have a lot of anxiety and fear. And so then I stopped, and then he started looking, and he's like, now mind you, this guy's 62. And this was about 4 years ago. And he said, when I was 5 years old, and I said to myself, well, this is going to be good. And so he said, well, when I was 5 years old, I was walking home from school, and I was in the kindergarten. And he said, I really didn't know how to read and write, but I knew my alphabets, and I knew my numbers up to 10. And so I was walking home from school, and the street I lived on started with a letter P. And he said, so I was walking down, and I looked up, and I saw a sign, and it said a letter P. It said P, on his street. He couldn't read the street word, but he could see it started with a P. Mm-hmm. So he said to me, this is what he said. He says, I was convinced I was on my street. So then, now put yourself, go back to 5.
Okay.
So you're walking down the street at 5 that you're convinced is the street you live on. Mm-hmm. And then you walk to the place where your house is, and you look to where the house is supposed to be, and it's an empty lot. Now, pick it up from there. What are you feeling at 5, in that moment where you're convinced you're on your right street, and you go to where your house is supposed to be, and it's not there?
I'm terrified.
Okay.
I'm worried about my family, what happened to my house. I'm lost.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm terrified.
Okay. And hopefully it's not raining and thunderstorm, right? Right.
Yeah.
Right. Now stay there, stay 5. Now he says to me, he goes and sits on the curb in front of where the house is supposed to be, and that's what he started saying to himself. And he started saying, what happened to my house? My family has left me.
Yeah, I'm abandoned.
I'm all alone, and who's going to take care of me? And then he says, he's 5. He says, and what am I going to have for lunch? Right? Right?
Can't forget lunch. We gotta eat.
So he's sitting there, right? And he says, probably 30 minutes went by. He said it seemed like an eternity. So then I imagine his mom, she's frantic because he didn't make it home, so she's running to try to find him. So she finds him. And so she finds him, so they hug. And so he literally goes home and he gets his little robe on, he has his little house shoes on, and he's having milk and cookies. And I said, stop right there. I said, do you think the 30 minutes before that was erased from your brain when your mother rescued you? And he said, no. And then he had an epiphany. And he said to me, he said, I've always struggled with fear all my life, and I never knew why. He said, I've made it through life. I live a good life, and I got my master's degree, and living a good life, and I'm healthy, and family, kids, everybody's good. He said, but he said, every 3 or 4 years, I would always have a fear meltdown. I get over it, but I just couldn't figure out why this would happen. Because remember, he came in for something that was totally unrelated to a fear discussion, but actually it really wasn't. It was all connected. It took me a while to figure it out. So what it took me a while to figure out is that when his boss told him to go home and work, she triggered, and you said it earlier, you're real bright. She triggered, he didn't realize he had abandonment issues. So when that happens to you, now mind you, it was only 30 minutes of his life.
Right.
It didn't happen again. It just was a one-time event.
Right.
And his mom rescued him, and he went home, and he was safe and secure, and he had milk and cookies, like I said, right? But it got recorded in his brain. For that 30 minutes, he was in terror. Like you said, I'm terrified.
Right.
That doesn't get unrecorded, and in that moment, his survival circuits kicked on. Now, he was rescued, so his survival circuits didn't have to really activate and have him go, he probably was in frozen, fight, flight, or freeze. He was frozen. He said he sat on the curb in front of the house. So he was probably sitting there didn't know what to do, didn't know where to go.
Right.
So he was frozen.
Right.
Right? He, so his mom rescued him. So then he would say, well, I had all these issues. And then when he realized, when I said, well, the theme here, because he didn't get the theme. You would think he would have saw the theme. I said, well, I asked him, when he told me all these various stories of the meltdowns over the course of his life and what was happening at work, I said, what's the common denominator? And he said he didn't get it. He didn't quite get it. I said, abandonment. Think about it. Your boss wants you to go home and work. Or at first she wanted you to retire. And then, you don't want to do that. And then she said, go home and work.
Let's get rid of you. We don't want you anymore.
Right. And I like being around my coworkers.
Yeah.
And I like working around people because people make you feel safe when you've been abandoned. See, in that moment, he was lost and by himself and alone. Right? Okay. And that program got wired. It didn't turn off. It grew into those different 8 legs of fear that I was telling you about earlier. And it started to affect him in education, in his self-esteem, his career. It didn't stop him, but he always struggled with fear, he said.
So those 30 minutes impacted him for decades to come in various ways.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Now, here's the beauty of the story. Now, he's an IT guy. And when I told him how this all played out in his head and the abandonment was the trigger and I connected it back to work and then he could see all the stories of his life sync up. Then he came back the next week, and he didn't know I was working on a book. Here's the funny thing about it. I had just started conceptualizing this book. He didn't even know I was writing a book. He came back the next week, and he explained my theory of the book to me, and I never told him the book theory.
Wow.
Because he's an IT guy, and this is an IT problem. And so in the book, the way I write it in the book, it's like we're the computer, and these bad stories are virus infections into our hard drive. And a lot of people can, most people have a computer or phones or whatever, so we understand the computer virus analogy. So he said to me, and I'm gonna find this patient too, because I'm ready for what he offered me. He said, look, I can do a 3D model for you of your theory.
Wow.
Because the IT people get this one real fast.
Yeah.
Because what happens is that your mind at that point has become infected. You become infected with fear. Overexposed to some sort of attack. The attack was, I'm alone. I'm left abandoned. Who's going to take care of me? So I could be attacked. I'm vulnerable.
Yeah.
So those are the programs that start to run, and that becomes almost characterological, and it almost becomes our personality type.
Okay.
Because see, there's a voice that is created in my conceptualization, and again, this is all, anecdotal, theoretical kind of stuff, but that trauma, when those trauma circuits get activated, they also change the voice content in our head. And so the title of the book is called Shut Up, Stop Talking to Me, referring to that negative voice. That's where I think this voice begins to emerge.
Okay.
Because you begin to hear different things now inside your head. See, this little kid, he was a happy-go-lucky kid.
Right.
He never probably experienced fear before. And then so after this experience, he was wired toward fear.
So I heard you say that this circuitry gets activated, right? So is this something that we can turn on or turn off? Because what I'm hearing is, this happened to him when he was a kid and impacted him well into his 60s. Was he stuck?
Well, here's how I'd explain it to you. What I've learned about trauma and how the PTSD circuits work. Whenever you're overexposed to fear and or under attack, or use the word traumatized, you activate certain brain circuits, primarily the amygdala. That amygdala is that radar that I was talking about earlier. When you're flying on a plane, you don't turn the radar off. It stays on.
Right.
And so when you're navigating through life, when you leave out of the safe, secure, comfortable abode of your house and go out into the world, I believe your radar turns on immediately as soon as you walk out the door. Because it's designed automatically to just navigate behind the scenes any type of fear or attacks that you might have, even if you've never had any attacks. That's how the circuit automatically works. Now, if you've had attacks or overexposures to fear, then I think those circuits kind of get almost scorched, and they kind of stay on all the time, and I think they become oversensitized and overreactive, so that a person's circuits become their circuits make them think there's all kind of beeps on their radars.
Okay.
But a lot of times they're just false positives. They're false negatives. They're not really true things to be afraid of. But the radar is stuck on, well, look, we just want to make sure you're safe and secure, so we just going to alert you to everything.
Okay.
So when you go outside, it's dark, be afraid of the dark. When you go in and you're driving the car and you're on the street by yourself, so it just kind of gets overwired and it gets hot wired.
So we become hypersensitive.
Hypersensitive and overreactive, and then when you hit triggers, that's what turns these circuits back on. That's kind of the question you were asking, can we come out of this? A lot of people don't live necessarily in a state of fight or flight all the time, but some people can't come out of it because they're constantly around their triggers.
Okay.
And so like if you've been bullied as a kid, and let's say now you're, 6 feet old and you have martial arts and you take karate and you can kick anybody's butt, right? So ain't nobody gonna bully you physically.
Right.
But now you're in a work situation and you got a boss that you just can't kick their butt.
Yeah.
And now they're all in your face. Reminds me of a story of a nurse who had, she had been traumatized as a kid, and she fell down a flight of steps at work. And then it unleashed her alter ego. She didn't even know she had one. So one day, the doctor was pointing his finger in her face, and he wanted her to do something, and she picked up a pair of scissors, and she was getting ready to stab him. And she had no recollection of this at all. So she came to me. It took me a while to figure this out, until her alter came to therapy. Now, she actually had multiple personality disorder.
Okay.
She actually is kind of like where I figured some of this stuff out, because she was in a state of blackout anytime her alter got triggered. So anything that was attacking her, she had an abusive marriage, who her husband abused her physically. And then she grew up as a child fighting all the time. And her siblings made her go back and beat up the people that beat her up. So she grew up beating and fighting all the time, and then she went to college. She told me one time some girls thought that she wanted her boyfriend or something, or wanted their boyfriend, and she attacked this girl and cut her up. She don't even remember it. So what happens when she gets triggered, some of these people, because she was attacked, when she feels she's under attack, she blinks out, and her alter steps in and protects her.
Wow.
Violently sometimes. Now, I actually figured this out with multiple personality patients, sort of. And I also figured this out with my addictive patients. So, like with my addictive patients, they would come in for, having relapse, trying to get back into therapy. And so I did 10,000 evaluations. So I would hear all these stories about people who had all these, addictive relapses. And then I would hear, many people describe like, yeah, man, and I got a judge and my job, and they dropped me at work, and my wife said if I relapse, my kids said they would leave me, and my dog would bite me, and then they would relapse anyway. And I'm like,
knowing that they had
all these consequences.
Yeah.
And I'm like, what's more powerful than that?
Yeah.
I would hear these stories after, and people would have 5 years clean, 10 years clean, 2 weeks clean. It didn't matter. It seemed like whenever their alter ego, that's what I didn't know what I was dealing with at that point. I would just hear the stories, and I just logged all the stories, but I didn't really know what I was hearing, because my job was just to put you in treatment. But I cataloged all the stories I heard, and so when I started in private practice many years later, and I started working with addicted patients then, I would hear the same stories. I'm like, I heard that back when I was first in my early year of my career. And then I had a heroin patient. He came into my office after he had just got out the hospital because he lost his leg.
Wow.
He was in a wheelchair. He was still, he had bandages. He was still having to dress. He had just had the amputation, but he was a heroin addict. Now here's his story. And he's in the book. I write about him in the book a little bit. He reminded me of what I had learned about the addicts. I shouldn't use the word addict. My chemically dependent patients from the past. And he would describe, so his story was trauma. He was an athlete. He was a marathon runner. He took care of himself. He was a carpenter. And so the first trauma that happened was his house burnt down. They lost everything, he and his wife and kids. And then the second trauma happened. His one son was, he says, killed by the Oakland County Sheriff's Department. There's a lawsuit. They lost, but whatever. So the third trauma was the new house caught on fire again.
Oh, my gosh.
Can't make this stuff up. So he said he wasn't using drugs. He was clean. And he said because of his son and all this stuff, this loss and stuff, he started using heroin again. He used it many years ago, but he got off of it. He was clean for about 20 years. And then, so all these traumas happened. He was in his 50s. He was an older man. And so he had he was in so much pain, he said. He said that snorting heroin just didn't work. It didn't kill his pain, as he put it. And so he had the notion to inject heroin. He never injected, he said. He always snorted. He never injected it. So unfortunately, he got a bad dope of heroin that had the flesh-eating bacteria in it.
Wow.
And he injected it in his foot or somewhere. And then he said in about a half hour or so, he saw this black dot appear on his foot. And he ignored it, and then 2 hours later, it's the size of a dime. And then about 4 hours later, it's the size of a $50. And he said, you know what, as silly as he said it sounded, he said, I still neglected it and didn't go to the hospital until the next day. Because by the time he woke up the next day, his whole foot was black. Right. So then he gets to the doctor, and you can kind of imagine the story. they had to, amputate his foot. Well, they amputated below the knee because by that time the infection had kind of crawled up his leg, and so they were trying to catch it before it went any higher. So they did a below knee amputation first and didn't catch it all. So then he had to have above a knee amputation. So he had to have 2 amputations on one leg. So that's when he was coming to therapy. He was still using heroin and he was still battling with this. And so he would tell me like he would literally not want to use. And he would animate it out in my office. He'd be like, man, it would be like I have this other person inside of my head, and I'm trying not to get high. I want to stay clean. I want methadone, but my alter ego's like, no, methadone ain't shit. I want heroin. And so he was like, man, no, don't do it. And no, yes, go get it. No, don't do it. Yes, go get it. No, and he was just animating back and forth like he was having this internal battle inside of his head. Mm-hmm. And I said, I've seen that before. And that's when it was reminding me of my earlier years working with other chemically dependent patients. That's how they would describe it. And that would lead to a relapse. It always led to a relapse. So then I started to realize, I said, people, then it fascinated my curiosity. So then I started to do some research in the area of the addicted brain. So that's when I started to understand how all these addictive circuits get wired up. And then my little jump here was, once these circuits are wired up, they produce sort of an alter ego. Okay. Because what people would tell me is that they heard their own voice convince them. I had a patient tell me this yesterday. She just got out of rehab for 2 weeks drinking. And I asked her, I said, what we call it the bitch. I said, what is your alter ego saying to you now? Oh, you got 2 weeks clean. You got control again. And I said, I said, don't play with her. Mm-hmm. I said, because that's what everybody has told me was what got them tricked. They could have had 10 years, 20 years, a month, a half a century. And that's usually the thought that pops into their head first. And it's their voice. It's not my voice. It's not your voice. Mm-hmm. It's their voice. Saying, dude, I had a guy, he was clean off of cocaine for 15 years. The last time he used it, it put him in ICU for 2 weeks. He was in a coma. Wow. He stopped for 15 years. He was dropping off a friend from work at his apartment, and he happened to go in with him. His roommate, the friend's roommate, breaks out a plate of cocaine. So I said, stop right there. I'll tell you how you relapsed. I said, your alter ego said, oh, woo, oh, man, woo, I've been asleep for 15 years, woo, look at is that what I think it is? Is that cocaine? That's cocaine. Dude, we ain't seen that in 15 years. Man, you could do your little one-on-one. You got control. Dude, it's been 15 years. You go and get your little something. You got control. Yeah. He looked at me. He's like, how did you know that? I said, that's how they all are. That's what they all say. Yeah. So that's what let me understand this is like a running program. It's not like the person didn't want to get high. None of these folks wanted to relapse, but they did anyway.
And this doesn't just have to be an addiction to drugs or alcohol, right? Like, I hear all the time people who are dieting or trying to lose weight. I fell off the bandwagon. I had this many good days, and I went for one little bite of the cake, and then I ate the whole thing.
Right. Well, you're right. I mean, I think it's very true. These alter egos, what happens, I think, is that what I really realize is what happens is that some of these alter egos, and we'll talk about it in upcoming shows, about the different ones I've met over the course of my career. We're just kind of using the drug and alcohol one as sort of an example of how people can understand how the brain gets hijacked by this data entry. And here's what I would tell you is that the drug and alcohol alter egos are not the first ones the person has. That's usually what they're using to solve their primary problem, which I discovered is typically a trauma issue. Okay. An overexposure to fear or some type of attack.
That makes sense.
And then that fractures self-esteem. You're now wounded. You're in fight or flight. You have to medicate the overthinking mind because you can't sleep because you're just constantly and you got anxiety, and your mind is, and you can't sleep, and so you got to start medicating that to shut the brain down. And so you start to discover that alcohol and drugs work to shut down that brain, slow that brain down, quiet that brain down. And so inadvertently, because of the addictive nature of drugs and alcohol in the brain, it's a neurological problem. If you keep using drugs and alcohol over time, you change the neurological landscape of your brain, and you activate the brain circuits, the addictive brain circuits. You know, the nuclear accumbens, the prefrontal motor cortex, the amygdala is involved. And so you have all these different regions that get fused together, and they actually, what I would call in some of these trainings, would be the hijack brain.
Okay.
Because once those addictive circuits get fused and they get activated, they want drugs.
So once our brain is hijacked, that's when we start to do and believe whatever that voice, that alter ego is telling us.
Well, that's a great question, because what I really figured out what happens to people, and it's my new definition of mental illness, is that because the voice tone doesn't change, you still think it's you talking to yourself. See, it'd be different if I was walking around with you, whispering in your ear in my voice tone. You would know it's me and not you. But when it's inside your head with your own voice tone, you don't really see the separation of self. But what is the tip-off is you're only hearing negative, fear-invoking, self-sabotaging content. You know, you're hearing fear, basically.
Yeah.
And then you start to live in this fear place, which then triggers these fight or flight reactions.
So we were talking earlier, and you told me about a patient of yours who was about 80 and recalled an experience from around the time she was 3, right? That negative voice. Tell me a little bit more about her.
Well, you know, she and it was a very interesting journey. And, when I started to figure out this theory, what I realized is that it's not a one-size-fits-all, but it seems like everybody fits into some kind of way. So she came in for something totally unrelated. She was having some issues with her church, and she was having some health issues. And so we talked about all that stuff for months. And so one day we were just shooting the breeze, and so she's like, "Oh, I'm just afraid of everything." Now you tell that to a guy like me, I'm like, "Oh, really? So what do you mean?"
Yeah.
You know, and she's like, "Oh, I'm just afraid of everything. I'm just afraid to be alone. I'm just afraid of just about everything." I'm like, "Oh, really?" It didn't really come out before. You know, when we were talking, and so I said, "Oh, really?" I said, "How long have you struggled with fear?" She's like, "All my life." "Oh, all my life." I'm like, "Really?" And so I said, "Well, is there a story or something that you remember, or what was?" And I don't know if that was around the time when I had that first fear question. I can't remember if I was using that question, but I did kind of get back to try to get to a story or something. And she was really talking about what she was afraid of right now. So she would tell me about she was afraid to be at home alone in her house because they'd been broken into before, and just sort of here and now fear. I'm like, okay, and so I was like, okay, well, let me help you with that fear, and so next time we come, we'll talk more about it, blah, blah. So she comes back the next session, and she says, "Oh, guess what?" I was like, "What?" She said, I had a flashback. I'm like, "Really?" She's like, "You're not going to believe this." I'm like, "Really?" She says, "When I was about 3 and a half, we used to live in a bunker in Indiana." I said, "A bunker?"
Yeah.
She said, "Yeah, we used to take the steps down into our house." I was like, "That sounds like a bunker." She said, "So my dad was away to buy farm equipment. So it was me and my mom and my sister. And then the next thing I remember is my mother was putting us on top of a table because there was water coming in from the where the ladder was." And I'm like, water was coming in. She said, and then the next thing I remember, somebody had grabbed me by the back of my collar, and I was in a boat. The next thing I can remember, I said, "A boat?" I said, "Sound like your area was flooded,
right.
So maybe a dam broke or something." She's like, "I don't remember." She says, "But I remember that I thought I was going to die." I was like, "Oh, so you activated the death circuit." She said, "The death circuit?" And I said, "Yeah, where your body for that moment, even though you didn't know what death really was, your body knew you were in imminent danger of dying."
Mm-hmm.
So I said, so your fight or flight circuits kind of probably turned on at that moment. And then that's when she started stringing the rest of the story of her life, where she started to be afraid of school. Like, you know what she told me? What she could tell me was she could take me back to first grade. Mm-hmm. And that she was afraid to go to school on the first day. And because back then she said we went from home to first grade. Didn't have kindergarten. She's 80, remember? So I said, so she says, well, I said, well, tell me about that. She says, well, my mom took me to school. And then she says, and then my mom stayed with me for the whole day. And then she says, then my mom, actually, she stayed with me for the whole school year. I was like, the whole school year? I said, so what, you couldn't be left alone? She's like, no. And she says, I don't like being left alone now. And then her husband was with her. Mm-hmm. And he jumped in right at that moment. He says, we've been married for 52 years. And since I met her, I can never leave her alone. I was like, really? So then I was like, okay. And so then she took me back to, like, you know, this situation where she was like in first grade and her mom. And so I was like, okay. So then she comes back with this near drowning story. A month later, it wasn't like an immediate. She came back like it was like, oh, I had a flashback. And then a month or two later, she has another flashback where she had another drowning episode in a pool where she was about 5.5, where she actually almost died.
Okay.
And so she survived that. And so ironically, it all got tipped off one day as she was telling me these stories. And so, and I asked her, I said, well, do you have a water story? Because one day she told me she doesn't like being in pools and she doesn't even like taking baths. We kind of joke about these things. And so she didn't even realize she had a water trauma. Mm-hmm. So she had a water trauma. Her brain, her mind had blocked it all out. But she manifested anxiety at the subconscious, unconscious level. And so it really permeated her entire life. This woman has literally been afraid of everything her entire life. And she still is. I mean, the last time I talked to her, she's gotten better. But she still struggles with a lot of fear. So it's not really a successful case because, like, you were kind of alluding to, like, well, how do I treat these folks? Well, in her case, she'd have to... I offered her the carrot. I offered her an opportunity to really try to conquer her fear. Mm-hmm. She didn't want to take it on.
So, yeah, I'm looking at it. I'm like, she's 80-some years old. Yeah. If she experienced this when she was 3 and 5, how do you convince her that that's not who she is,
right.
After listening to that voice for so long?
I didn't even get there about that part with her. Like, you have an alter ego, and we didn't even go that far. She was really teaching me, really, about how you can stay in fight or flight all your life. Mm. You know what I mean? That's what she taught me. I didn't get a chance to really help her get out of her fear programming because she chose to really stay there. Okay. For whatever reason. I mean, some people feel they're so defeated by their alter ego that they don't take it on.
So for those people who realize that there is one, how do you treat them? Like,
right. Well, that's a good question. Well, a lot of this is discovery because most people walk in thinking they're the symptoms. For example, 70% of who walks in the office is typically anxiety and depression. Okay. That's 70% of the population. Most outpatient mental health clinics is anxiety and depression. So you listen to the anxiety, you listen to the depression stories and all that. But then I started to, listen to patients, and I would say, gosh, they don't have depression. They become depression. And so I would say to myself, like, well, where's their authentic self? I don't hear their real self. I hear the embodiment of their symptoms having become their self. Okay. So when I kind of played with that, I was like, they're gone. Their primary self is not there. They become depression. So everything they say, do, think, see, feel, think, smell, eat, drink, sleep, it's all depression.
And that's the brain being hijacked.
That's part of the brain being hijacked, okay. Right. And so they're in fight or flight, obviously, as well. And so part of the first step in treating these folks, which is just about everybody, myself included, I figured this out on myself first. So that's kind of what I write in the book. I had a big fear problem. And I would hear a lot of fear messages in my head. So what I discovered is how you solve this is to recognize you're not listening to your authentic self anymore. I read a book, and it was called Untethered Soul. Great book. And he says, like in the first chapter, that negative voice in your head is not your true voice. But he didn't kind of look at it from a trauma perspective. It's kind of what I kind of pieced together. But he is correct, though. That voice is not our authentic voice. So when I began to agree with that and accept that that voice is not my true voice, then I was able to separate that negative persona from my other self, which I realized had been suffocated into the program or the virus of fear. And so most people, when this happens, most of the day, if you ask people to, catalog their thoughts, authentic self versus, virus self, the virus side tends to have more content. They're hearing more from the virus side than their authentic side.
And that virus side is usually negative content.
It's always negative.
Okay.
And that's what kind of
So that's how we know
the
the difference
Yes.
between our authentic self and this virus.
You got it.
Okay.
You're going to hear a content shift. It's no longer you are powerful, you are beautiful, you can do anything you put your mind to. You don't hear that anymore. What you hear is, no, it's not for you. It's not going to work out.
So
Don't
how
try.
do we know that that's just not a low self-esteem thing?
Well, but again, if you really want to get to the root of this, and we might not be able to talk about it today, if you're in your authentic self, there's no such thing as a low self-esteem.
Okay.
Right? You're in your authentic self, your divine self, your creative self. That is your perfected self.
Okay.
That self is not contaminated by a virus. So low self-esteem, you weren't born with low self-esteem. How did you get one? Who told you had one? You told yourself you had one. Well, what was the justification for it? Well, you probably don't have any. Because when you ask people, why do you have a low self-esteem? Well, it's just what I have. They can't justify having it. It has no foundation to it, but that's what they live in. And so a lot of times people are really lost into this persona thinking it is still their true self. And that can happen very early in your life, like even when you're a kid. And so it begins to manifest in self-esteem. And so you don't feel confident in yourself. You don't feel like if you've been attacked and you've been bullied and no one came to your rescue, then you might tell yourself, I'm not worth being rescued. I wasn't worth somebody sticking up for me. So I'm worthless. Now you might say, well, that's quite a jump. No, these are true stories. This is what I hear people say to themselves. And I would say to myself, like, well, why would we say this to ourselves? Why would we defeat our own self in this way? Why do we hear our own voice in our head and let it shut us down from our life? So that's when I was like, well, what is going on here? Like you just asked the question, why does the brain do this? And so again, that was the last piece of the theory that I couldn't quite figure out. But what I figured out is that because this all comes from the activation of the trauma circuits, that negative voice, if you listen to it and you let it manifest and you play out what you hear, what typically happens with your life? We talked about this while we were warming up for the show. So like say if you've got you've been bullied and then, you didn't resolve that bullying issue when you were a kid, what might you grow up feeling about yourself? You could feel like, I'm not worth, I can't protect myself. I can't stand up for myself. So what might happen? You might not speak up for yourself.
Right.
And you might walk around with your head down, which makes you another target for bullying. You might somehow justify in your own way of thinking, I deserve to be bullied. And so that's where we start to damage ourselves with our own voice. But what I argue at that point is that's not you actually your authentic self saying that to you. That's your trauma circuit saying that to you in order to kind of shut down your life. Now you're just like, well, why would it do that? Well, the way it plays out, the way I kind of see it is anytime that you are feeling vulnerable, exposed, got to make a change, you're triggering these trauma circuits. And so your trauma circuits turn on like that radar on the plane and like, boop, 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 start beeping. And it's saying, well, what's beeping? And so it starts sending you messages. And these messages come in form of a physiological message and a cognitive message. So the physiological part of it is you start to get a little shaky, and, a little queasy. You might get a little lightheaded. You might get a little dizzy, a little sweaty. Then the cognitions come along with reinforcing there's something negative happening. There's something to be afraid of right now. There's something not right here. And so we start to then adopt this sort of, we listen to the radar more than investigating what the radar is trying to tell us. And so because we're automatically programmed in this way, our circuits are activating on fight or flight. So anytime that we're activating attack or fear, and change is fear. Most people, when you got to change or do some major change, it triggers anxiety. That turns on these circuits. And so then your circuits begin to calculate this fear that you're about to explore. Let's say a job change out of state. And you got the degrees, you got the experience, you got the qualifications, but you start to, get this fear like, I don't know, it costs a living out there. I don't know nobody, and I don't know if they're going to like me out there. So we start this self-doubt, and we start second-guessing ourselves, and we're still thinking we're talking to ourselves.
Right.
And what I'm arguing is, no, that's your trauma circuits talking through you, trying to really protect you just from a basic thing. We don't want you to feel anxiety. And we don't want to ever have you feel fear again. The first time that you got bullied and beat up, we weren't on. So we couldn't alert you to, like, that bully is coming for you and you should run that way. We didn't get turned on until after he beat you up. So we're sorry about that. But now that we're turned on, we're not turning off.
So it's like we're being tricked.
Well, it can be tricked, because we as the observer, we have to look at the radar screen because the circuits are working properly. Now, sometimes they're over-activated, so then we become afraid of everything, like that lady I was telling you about. She's afraid of everything. Anything triggers her anxiety, and so it's not supposed to work that way. She never resolved her unconscious traumas from childhood. She had 3 of them. So that still was running like a buried program behind the scenes, just like a virus runs in a computer. Sometimes people have a virus on their computer and they don't even know they have one. And how do you know you have one? Till your computer starts acting up.
Yeah.
And then you say, why is my email not working? Why is it slowing down? And then you run an antivirus program. And then you say, oh, you got the Trojan virus, or you got the whatever.
So is that where the healing begins, when we start to do the investigation into these traumas?
Well, that is part of it. Absolutely. What I've learned is that trauma has a real deleterious way of activating these circuits. And we said trauma, but like I said, I define it as overexposure to fear and or feelings of being under attack of some type. And when that happens, that begins to create that shift in the brain. And then we go into, for protection, our authentic self goes into the protection of the trauma circuits. Remember, they're here to protect us and to protect us from life or death. So, for example, if you and I get dropped off in a helicopter in the middle of a jungle and we hear lions roaring to the north, which direction are we not running in?
We're not running north.
We're not running north. And why are we not running north?
Because there's lions. There's danger there waiting for us.
Are we having a conversation about it, or are we just running all of a sudden?
We're running.
We're running because our natural instinct is to run. So the circuits turn on just like that, the reptilian brain.
Okay.
Now with human beings, however, we have that cognitive part of our brain that has to process, well, girlfriend, we were just chased by them lions, and we sit in the bar having a margarita, and we having a panic attacks talking about, our experience about being chased by a lion, and we got away. The animals that get away, they just go back to grazing. They're not sitting there in trauma thinking about, that lion, woo, we just got away from that lion, and woo, they're just going back to their natural reset state. We as humans don't. We will stay in fight or flight until we process out and go to therapy and talk about the lion chasing us and all that. We will have an issue with it. Or, for example, you and I walk out onto the street and we see somebody get hit by a bus.
Mm-hmm.
You might like, oh God, I'm never going to take a bus again, and I'm afraid to go outside. And because I'm a former EMT, worked in emergency rooms, I might run to the rescue. I'm gonna go into fight mode. You might go into flight mode. Like, well, I'm gonna get in my car, I'm gonna leave, and I'm gonna go to the scene because I'm an EMT, and I'm gonna go into fight trying to save this person's life.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not gonna really think about it. Probably, it's just gonna be kind of a natural reaction. So just like we can be on a roller coaster, and you don't like roller coasters, and I love them, and we're in the first car. So we hit that first hill, you screaming, I'm screaming.
For different
I'm having
reasons.
fun, you're having a panic attack.
Right.
It's a matter of how we interpret the situation.
Okay.
And so a lot of this is what I'm learning about the nature of the trauma brain, if you would. So once it gets turned on, once it gets overexposed to a fear, it has a tendency to stay activated, almost overactivated, and in some ways begins to shut our life down, depending on the life that we're living.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're around a lot of attacks or triggers to your trauma circuits, then you get these panic reactions. And then I think also you get the cognitions that go with it that help you navigate through a panicky situation. So for example, if you've had issues with people and the bullying scenario, now let's say you're an adult and you can do martial arts. But now you're in a work situation and your boss is in your face, like I said, and you can't beat your boss up.
Yeah.
So you've got to be able to handle the reaction that your body is giving you to go into fight mode. And so that's where I think a lot of people have to begin to understand how their body can easily go into fight or flight when they're around different triggers. So as long as you're not around triggers, many people stay out of that fight or flight circuitry. But if you're in a life of attack or in situations where you're vulnerable or exposed, you could stay in fight or flight most of the day. I've read many books on trauma, and many authors have said most of us during our waking day stay in various states of fight or flight.
Wow.
Yeah. And so that voice is created in our head with our voice content, and we start to hear fearful things with our voice tone, thinking it's the truth about the situation of our life. And that to me is my new definition of mental illness.
Okay.
Because you're not listening, you're not hearing from your authentic self. You're hearing from your trauma self, which is more your fear self, the circuits of fear. And fear has a voice. And that's what people tend to hear predominantly.
So we talked a little bit about the different voices in persona, and I know we're going to get into that in some future episodes. So what's the first one? What's next?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. Well, as we kind of wrap up this podcast, and thank you for kind of debuting that, the purpose of today's show was to really lay out the premises of this theory, the discovery of how these circuits work, and that most of us are struggling with a negative inner voice. That I kind of know, I think is a pretty consistent thing in our population. A lot of us battle with that negative inner voice. So what I've learned in doing a lot of my therapy work is that when I ask people, what do you hear?
Mm-hmm.
I've been introduced to several different alter egos. They're not all the same. Now, here's what I would tell you. They all run on a fear mainframe, but they all have different sort of characteristics. So I've met depressed ones. Most of them are anxiety ones or fear.
Okay.
I've met the suicidal ones. They're nothing to play with because they continue to send you a message to go kill yourself. I work with a lot of soldiers and veterans. They have a soldier sometimes that won't turn off, and that's what they battle with. Mm-hmm. I've met hypersexual alter egos or hyposexual alter egos. So I've met, and we'll talk about this particular one in detail, and we're going to have people that come in to share their stories about their own individual alter ego. So we'll have somebody come in these shows kind of talk about their experiences with their alter ego since I've shared this theory with them. So for example, we'll have a patient who comes in with substance abuse issues.
Okay. And
they'll talk about how they conceptualize battling their drug and alcohol alter ego under this framework. And then we'll have people with depression and people with anxiety. And then I'll have a veteran in to talk about their soldier. And then I'll have people with hypersexual issues talk about their hypersexual alter egos. And I met a new one the other day. I guess we call it thug thug gangster alter ego. And
Okay.
right. Well, I think a lot of these alter egos are comprised of a person's experiences in life.
Mm-hmm.
So if you've grown up as a drug dealer or as a gangster or a gang banger, but now you're reformed and you've got a degree and you are working in corporate America, there's still a side to you that can get triggered, where that old thug, that old gangster can come out, but he's not productive in this setting anymore.
Right.
And so I'll tell you about that story when we do that particular show. And it's a remarkable story. And then the one about the hypersexual, I've worked with a lot of sexually assaulted patients, and sometimes they do tend to hypersexualize or hyposexualize. We don't have any sex at all. And so I have a case that I work with a young lady whose entire personality was completely suffocated into what we call the dancer girl. And so when she gets stressed about money, I call it the dancer girl turns on, and then she'll end up going dancing in clubs.
For money.
She's a genetic scientist.
Wow.
Right. So it's like it's almost like it's a true multiple, but it's actually not. At first, I wasn't sure, but I'll tell you about that story. I mean, it's a remarkable journey of really how you can be so suffocated by your trauma circuits as a way to protect you. But they create some very negative outcomes in trying to protect you. And this young lady, her entire personality was just completely absorbed into the dancer girl.
Wow.
And it's quite a story. So when we talk about that one, I think it'd be very fascinating for our listeners. So, but we could talk more and more about the theory. And as we do these additional podcasts, more will be revealed. I'm just kind of giving a real overview of what I've learned and, how I approach this with people. And it's been a very helpful model. And the reason why I'm writing the book and doing these podcasts is because it's helping people get well. Yeah.
And that's the most important thing.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's Dr. Chris Allen Shreve, guys, and his book is Shut Up, Stop Talking to Me, coming to us soon. He's still
indeed.
working on it.
Right.
So I'm looking forward to talking about it with you more, and until next time.
All right. Thank you.
Are you the one, struggling with negative thoughts in your head that wake you up at 3 a.m.? Are you the one, trying to shut up that voice with medications or drugs to no avail, maybe even having an addiction now? Are you the one, that is under the control of your fear alter ego? Well, if that's the case, then sit back, tune in, and listen up to Shut Up, Stop Talking to Me, a podcast by Dr. Chris Allen Shreve, Ph.D. This is an in-depth clinical expose into the mind of trauma and the negative voice. Stay tuned.